Awesome, students. It's good to see you once again. This is part 2 for our remote learning discussion about guilt and internal conflict and conscience and things on that nature as it relates to Macbeth. As I mentioned, this is going to be on Act 2. It's significantly shorter in terms of the textual evidence that we're going to discuss. So hopefully our video will be significantly shorter also. Let me share now the document with you. So as always, you're welcome to use any Macbeth document. In this case, I'm using the McDougall-Lytell. You're welcome to use the No Fear, or maybe a personal copy that you have, or just some sort of random version that you found on the internet. They're all the same for the most part. So we're at the beginning of Act 2. And as we mentioned before, most of the dialogue, most of the lines here are pertaining to Macbeth, and most of them are delivered really from Macbeth. In this case here, there's an exception. This is Banquo. And Banquo is responding to Macbeth when Macbeth asks him a question about the loyalty and things of that nature. So what we're really looking at here, we're going to looking at Act 2, Scene 1, lines 24 through 28. Now what I've done, I've highlighted actually the margin notes in the bottom corner because honestly I think they're pretty effective. But let me sort of set the stage for you. In essence, Macbeth asks Banquo if he's willing to be loyal to him, so long as Macbeth sort of returns him, gives him some honor and favor and things of that nature. And Banquo understandably says, yeah, of course. But there's a caveat, 2 caveats really to be specific. But let's read it from Banquo's own language here. So we're looking at lines 26 and 27, then we're going to flip over to 28 also. It says, so Macbeth asks, it says, so I lose none in seeking to augment it, but still keep, and this is the important part, still keep my bosom franchise and allegiance clear, I shall be counseled. So Banquo makes it very clear that he'll be loyal to Macbeth so long as he can keep his bosom franchised. So what does that mean? Well, his bosom franchise, his conscience clear, his bosom where his heart is. So his conscience clean, and then also allegiance clear, remain loyal to, of course, King Duncan here. So again, we have this example of internal conflict, of guilt, of conscience, so on and so forth. But in this case here, it's Banquo making sure that he doesn't have conflict. It's Banquo making sure that he doesn't prick his own conscience, if you will, something, of course, that Macbeth does not do well for himself. Speaking of Macbeth, almost the very next line, we have this very famous moment with Macbeth seeing a floating dagger. And we're looking at Act 2 still, Scene 1. We're looking at lines 32 to 33, but really it stretches all the way down here to the end of the page to about line 63. So it's a lengthy segment. It's not so much a soliloquy because he's talking to the dagger, but nonetheless, it's the same concept because no one's there. So he sees this floating dagger, and the famous line is this a dagger which I see before me? Now, this isn't going to be the last time that Macbeth possibly hallucinates. In this case here, he's seeing something. Later on, he's going to hear some things, whether they're voices or sounds. And so usually when you're hallucinating, at least on this level here, it's probably a case of a guilty conscience, right? It's probably a case of internal turmoil that's taking place. So the dagger is floating in front of him, and it's the handle pointed towards him, and Macbeth tries to reach out and grab it, but he fails because it's not physically there. So instead, he draws his own dagger. And then the dagger, quote unquote, marshals, and we're looking at line 41, marshals him or leads him to King Duncan's room, where Macbeth said he was going to go to that place anyway. So this is this concept of, it's interesting because he's in the midst where he's going to assassinate King Duncan. So you think that he's been settled on here, but yet he's having a hallucination, which tells you otherwise. Now, finally, at the bottom of the page here, line 61, he hears a ring of the bell. And then what's happening is Macbeth says that I go and it is done. The bell invites me, hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell. What's interesting here is he tells Duncan that he doesn't want to hear it. Later on, he's going to hear a knock. And then he's going to say, I wish you could hear it. But this is after he's already killed him. And so we have this nice juxtaposition of this guilt, of this internal conflict, versus like the clean conscience that's going on here. So let's continue moving on here. And as you see, we don't have too many pieces of textual evidence that we're looking at. And most of them are sort of clumped in the first half of Act 2 here, rather. So let's continue on here. remember how I spoke about how he's hallucinating. So prior to this particular moment, he thinks that people saw him go in there and kill Duncan. No one did, of course. But importantly, the guards, he hears them saying prayers and things on that nature. And then he tries to say amen at the end of the prayer. By the way, we're looking at scene 2, lines 29 to 31. So he says that he tried to say amen, but he couldn't pronounce the words. Now, the word amen, most of you know that that's something that you say at the end of the prayer. And what amen literally means, it means like I agree or I confirm with whatever it is that you're praying. So he can't physically say I agree. He can't physically say I amen. Of course, the reason why he can't is because his conscience is not clean. It's not clear. And that guilt is holding him back from acting in inevitably like this benevolent way, this spiritual way, because now he's lost the ability to sort of have that interaction with God. Remember, we talked about in the last video that there were consequences both on heaven and then on earth. Well, this might be the heavenly consequence that his conscience is sort of pricking with. Now, if we jump down to the next line here, right? And we're looking at lines 33 rather than 35. And so he's hearing more voices, more hallucinations, right? In this case here, he's hearing the voice cry out, sleep no more, sleep no more. And so Macbeth says later on that sleeping is only the innocent can sleep, or the innocent sleep, if you will. And so why can't he sleep? Why can't he, and I'll use this, why can't he take advantage of the balm that sort of heals hurt minds? Balm is like an ointment of healing. Well, because his conscience, once again, because of the guilt that he's feeling within himself. We continue on once more. If you take a look here, no, we'd already taken a look at that one, pardon me. So we jump down here to line 49. We're still in Act 2, Scene 2. And Lady Macbeth, in essence, has been like, you know, you were sloppy. You know, you got to do these things with the guards and so on and so forth to make sure that we don't get caught. And Macbeth says, I'll go no more. Meaning, I'm not going to go into that room. Well, why? Well, he says in line 49, I am afraid to think what I have done. I mean, that speaks volumes about his conscience, right? It speaks volumes about the guilt that he's suffering. And then our last quote that we're going to take a look at in this sort of very short analysis of the first half of Act 2 as it relates to guilt and things on that nature is jumping down just a few more lines to line 56. So we're looking at Act 2, Scene 2, line 56, and he's hearing knocking again. Now, in this case here, the knocking actually exists, but we don't know that as an audience member really until Scene 3 begins. But in this case here, we're not sure if it's a hallucination or not. And so, like all of the other sounds or images that he's seeing or hearing, again, this relates to his guilt, this relates to his conscience. And the real stick here, the real stickler here with regards to say, yeah, this is definitely him feeling guilty, is what he says at the very, very end of the scene here. So Macbeth says, and we're looking at line 71, says, to know my deed, 'twere best not to know myself. And he hears the knock again, and he says, wake, Duncan, with thy knocking. I would thou couldest. So he says, I wish you'd wake up, because why? The guilt. Now, interestingly, and I mentioned this before, remember the bell ringing, he says, you're not going to wake. But now he's committed the deed. His guilt is almost overwhelming, and he hopes that he could hear this bell or this knocking so that he could wake up, and therefore he would not have, committed regicide or the killing. So that's it for Act 2 for us. And like I said, if I've already did Act 1 for you, if you haven't had an opportunity to take a look at it, take a look at that also. I'm always approachable by email. Just send me an email. And I'll also sort of work on Act 3 for you too, as it relates to guilt and internal conflict and so on and so forth. You ladies and gentlemen are doing wonderful in this difficult, challenging time. And I look forward to seeing you again very shortly. Be safe.